A European army. It was an idea proposed by Emmanuel Macron, hailed by Vladimir Putin, but attacked by Donald Trump. But does Europe need its own military, and can it do without the U.S. in matters of defense? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rochelle Carey. French President Emmanuel Macron and the U.S. President Donald Trump have been at odds on many issues. This week, that divide went further when President Macron appeared to call for the creation of a European army. Macron says Europe needs to defend itself against potential threats from nations, including Russia, China, and even the United States. But it's not just about defense. The two leaders differ on almost every issue. Trump has pulled out of a number of global treaties, from climate change to the Iran nuclear deal and recently the disarmament treaty with Russia. While Macron has repeatedly emphasized the need for a global order and rejection of nationalism. He made the call during Sunday's remembrance ceremony in Paris to mark the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War.
Cette vision de la France comme nation généreuse,
This vision of France as a generous nation with a vision which carries universal values has been, in those dark times, exactly the opposite of the selfishness of a people which only looks at its own interests. Because patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is its betrayal. By saying our interests first and never mind the others, you erase what is most precious to a nation.
As President Donald Trump attacked the idea of a European army in a tweet before leaving for France on Friday, this is what he wrote. President Macron of France has just suggested that Europe build its own military in order to protect itself from the U.S., Russia, and China. Very insulting, but perhaps Europe should first pay its fair share of NATO, which the U.S. subsidizes greatly. Russian President Vladimir Putin welcomed the idea of a European army during a television interview.
As to alternative European military forces, it's not a new idea. President Macron has revived it now, but I was told about it by one of the previous French presidents. Europe is a great economic power, a great economic union, so it's quite natural that they want to be independent, self-reliant, and sovereign in the sphere of defense and security.
According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, global military spending reached $1.739 trillion last year. In Europe alone, it's accounted for $342 billion. That is 20% of the total global spending. 4 of the 15 largest military spenders in the world are in Western Europe. That's France, the UK, Germany, and Italy. Breaking this down, France's spending between 2016 and 2017 fell by nearly 2% to $57.8 billion, while Britain's military spending rose by 0.5% to $47.2 billion last year. And Germany's military spending went up by 3.5% to $44.3 billion, its highest level since 1999. Let's bring in our guests now. Joining us from Paris is Renaud Girard, Chief Foreign Correspondent at Le Figaro newspaper and Professor of Strategy at Paris School of International Affairs. In Washington, D.C., David Rochas, Associate Professor at the National Defense University and a former Pentagon official. And in Moscow, Glenn Dyson, Professor of International Relations at Higher School of Economics in Moscow and author of The Decay of Western Civilization and Resurgence of Russia. Welcome to all of you. So let's revisit the words of Emmanuel Macron from yesterday when he said, patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is a betrayal of patriotism. He went on to say our first interests, who cares about the others. I'm going to start with you, Renaud. What do you make of Macron's words, the timing, the setting?
I think what is important is that Macron in Paris wanted to defend multilateralism in front of Trump that actually rejects multilateralism. We have seen that for climate change. We have seen that for Iran. We have seen that for INF and many other treaties. President Macron thinks that European Union is the most important political creation of the post-war era when Donald Trump criticizes European Union as being some kind of jail for the nations of Europe. So there's really two opposite views on that, and it's true that President Macron thinks that there is an American threat, not like on a military, usual military threat, because of course France and America are allied in NATO, but he thinks that Europe is threatened on cyber war by China, Russia, and the United States. And as a matter of fact, you know that the Élysée Palace in Paris has been hacked. It was in 2012 during the presidential election between Sarkozy and Hollande. Élysée Palace had been hacked by the American NSA, National Security Agency, which has got a budget of $12 billion a year. So yes, President Macron thinks that there is a threat of cyber espionage, of cyber war from America to Europe, and he wants a European answer to that threat. Yes.
Okay. All right. We will come back to that in just a moment. But I want to put the same question to David. What do you make of Macron's words, and who else might he have been addressing besides just Donald Trump?
Well, it's very interesting. Donald Trump's unpopularity in Europe gives European leaders a real challenge whenever he comes there, which is you have to be just polite enough that he won't create an incident and storm out. But for your domestic audience, you kind of have to show that you're standing up to him. But I think that Macron's remarks were aimed not so much at Trump, but first off at Merkel, who is fatally wounded. And I think that this represents Macron's position to put France in leadership of Europe in place of Germany, now that Merkel is limping towards a finish line, which I don't think she'll survive till.
I want to make sure I'm clear on what you're saying, though. Not calling her out on patriotism versus nationalism per se, not that, but you mean just making such a grand statement in such a setting. Is that what you mean?
That's exactly right. And the second thing is, I think Macron domestically, the bloom is off the rose in France. And I think what he's trying to do is use his position as a world leader surrounded by world leaders to try to discredit various nationalist parties like the, Rally National, Marine Le Pen's movements, Viktor Orban in Hungary, those sorts of things. That's what I think he's after.
Okay. All right, Glenn, you actually said that most countries have both, have a combination of nationalism and patriotism, not necessarily in the same balance. What do you mean by that?
Well, nationalism and patriotism, they're not synonyms, but Macron is incorrect in terms of stating that they're complete opposites. Nationalism tends to refer to ethno-cultural identity, while patriotism tends to refer to a civic identity, so values and morality. Now, no country has ever had either or. There's always been a balance of both. And usually that's what prosperous societies do have. They have a they have a balance of both. So I don't think that this is saying that nationalism is the opposite of patriotism is not correct. I think that there's some caution towards nationalism as it's been the source of war. However, it's worth noting that nationalism is able to harbor some very powerful loyalties in terms of bestowing both meaning and security to a people. So it's also the reason why countries go to war, but it's also the reason why people are willing to give their life in wars as well. So stripping countries of this also entails robbing them to a great extent of national identity. So I just don't see any country in the history of the world who's only relied on a civic identity without a nationalist component, not a prosperous country at least. But I think this reflects this move towards populism, because over the last 20, 30 years, there's been a huge push towards more globalism and, I guess, civic ideals, while the nation state has been seen as something to be overcome, especially in the realm of this EU project. So I think that this populist rise is a response to it, in which they see the world now as being nationalist versus this global cosmopolitanism. And I think that's where Trump is coming from, and I think that Macron is attacking it, but I don't think it's completely correct in terms of putting them against each other. And nationalism is also not doesn't contradict the idea of multilateralism either, as nation states do cooperate without necessarily sharing the same ideals and values.
David, let me bring you back into this. Donald Trump, clearly stated recently that he is a nationalist, but and that's often what his rhetoric depicts, right? But when it comes to actual policy, for the most part, U.S. foreign policy is still fairly traditional. It's not really lining up with his rhetoric, right?
Right. Well, Trump is not a political scientist and he's not a traditional politician. So he uses these phrases imprecisely, and he uses them in ways to evoke emotion rather than, if you go down the line of following logical implications and explaining it, it's a fool's mission. I think that his view on foreign relations is that multilateralism is fine, we're happy to do that, but not if it is a vehicle for lesser powers, like France, to constrain the United States, which has not just great power, but also has global responsibilities and quite frankly cannot meet its global responsibilities or advance its interests globally if multilateralism becomes a restraint on it. And that's really the fundamental organizing principle of Trump's international relations. It's not America first at all expense. It's America in order to meet its obligations, and America in order to meet its expectations.
So, Renaud, you mentioned a while ago, just at the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about the army that Emmanuel Macron called for. Were his words, do you think, misconstrued? It seemed at first that it was, he was calling for a European army against the U.S., but that's not quite what he meant. What do you think he really meant?
No, it's not to build an army against the U.S. because Macron is agreeing with NATO. France has been an ally of the United States of America for the last 2 centuries, and and Macron will not jeopardize this alliance. And we are in a military alliance called NATO, and this will not be questioned. But there is also the field of cyber war. And in the cyberspace, yes, Europe have been attacked by Russia, by China for technological industrial spying, and also by America, because we know that the Élysée Palace in Paris has been hacked by the NSA, the National Security Agency of America, in 2012, in April 2012. So Macron Macron is not scared by any threat of military US aggression against Europe, of course not, but he thinks that there is a matter on cyberspace, on cyber war, and he wants a strategic answer from Europe to the cyber offensives by China, Russia, and America.
So,
on nationalist regimes, I just want to say that they don't like multilateralism, as we saw that before the Second World War, we had Germany, Japan, and Italy, who had nationalist regimes who didn't like and who destroyed and who left all the multilateral institutions of the time. I'm speaking, of course, of La Société des Nations.
Glenn, do you agree with that assessment from Renaud that Macron was talking about a cyber war?
Well, I think Macron left some deliberate strategic ambiguity within his comment because he obviously wants to take a swipe at Trump. I guess the Europeans have felt a bit insulted by Trump over the past year, so they would like to, I think they both for a domestic audience, but also for a bit of a pushback. There's some incentive to come with a little insult, I guess, but I don't think actually that the French wants to build an army against the Americans, of course. I would have a pushback on the European Union's multilateralism, though. It does push it sometimes in the global sphere, but in the regional sphere, especially when it comes to relations with Russia, I haven't really seen any multilateral initiatives. If anything, the EU tends to try to use the collective strength of its 28 member states for asymmetrical leverage against any of its partners, especially Russia then. So I think this multilateralism is more on the global sphere.
David, in an article in the New York Times that was summing up the last few days in Paris, there's a line that says, "No one has done more to break up the post-war global system in the last couple of years than Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin." Do you agree with that?
Well, I agree with the Putin part of it. The Trump one, I don't think so. I think that what you're seeing is not so much, you see the rhetoric of breaking up, but that's businessman techniques. If I don't get a deal, I'm walking away out of the room.
But David,
when you look at the actual actions that...
But David,
yes.
words matter. Diplomacy matters, particularly words from the President of the United States. He seems to often be tougher on his allies than he is on, say, Russia or Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, that's a common critique, and I think it's a fair one. But you know, the cliche from the election was that his critics take him literally but not seriously, and his allies take him seriously but not literally. And I got to tell you, if you take this president literally, you're going to go crazy, because he doesn't speak in a little way. He doesn't have the precise language of a diplomat. He speaks to America's heartland. He's not about scrapping these regimes, but there is a common, consensus in America. Why should we be more concerned about Europe's defenses than the Europeans? That's where he comes from. But, prior to the election, there was all this talk that he was going to pull the United States out of NATO. You have to disaggregate negotiating stances, which, again, are more in common with a businessman than with a diplomat, from his actual policies. And the policies have not been that far outside of the mainstream of American foreign policy.
Glenn, Vladimir Putin says that he kind of likes the idea that Macron, and he's not the first person to have brought this up, this idea of a European army. Why would Vladimir Putin like it?
Well, I would maybe define it more as a cautious optimism, because Russia recognizes NATO as the greatest threat to its security, and I guess an EU army would be supported to the extent that it would dilute the centrality of NATO as this instrument for maintaining a unipolar order. So I think Putin sees a possible EU army as something that would transition the world more towards a multipolar system, which is more balanced, and also where security depends more on compromise and harmonization of interest, rather than the collective West essentially asserting its dominance over the rest of the world. So I think for that reason, that's the reason why he would actually welcome it. I think he's also critical of the EU, though, because the European Union also has similar zero-sum structure. Keep in mind that Russia's main security concern is that in Europe we never really reached a post-Cold War settlement. That is, we still maintain the structures from the Cold War, and the EU to a large extent follow the same path as NATO. So when we talk about European integration, we're largely referring to a zero-sum format in which countries in the shared neighborhood has to choose between us or Russia. So the EU has very much this zero-sum approach, and I guess the concern will be if they militarize this approach. But that being said, it would be a step towards a multipolar construct, which would definitely be welcomed by Moscow, as it would start to solve this problem. But I would say that Russia's main objective has, ever since Gorbachev, be to construct a common European home. This is far from a common security structure in Europe, but it's definitely the lesser of two evils if the alternative is simply having NATO running the show.
Renaud, let me ask you about Russia. We talk a lot about Russia. We often look to see what Vladimir Putin's reaction to things are. But can you put in some sort of perspective the actual size of Russia and their contribution to the world? And it seems that they're often... it's the best phrase I know, punching above their weight class. Like their influence outsizes what their actual footprint is.
Yes, of course. I mean, the wealth of Russia, the yield of Russia, the national product of Russia is the same as Italy, so it's not very strong. But, of course, Russia is a nuclear country. Russia has got a strong army. Russia has got a very active and successful, we have to recognize, policy in the Middle East. Russia just has won a war in Syria and is respected for that by all countries of the Middle East. And of course, Russia is considered, especially by the eastern countries of the European Union, as a threat after its military intervention in Donbass in the summer 2014. But Russia is not considered as a threat in more Western countries of Europe, like Italy, Spain, France, Belgium. Even the Germans don't really think that Russia is a threat to them. What kind of influence Russia has got? I think that it has been like exaggerated. People have said that, Russia had an influence on Brexit. I don't think it is true. I think this is all English idea of Brexit, British idea of Brexit. People have said that Russia had an influence on the Italian elections. I don't believe so. And even people said that, Russia had an influence on French politics. Yes, it's true that Marine Le Pen was received in the Kremlin by Vladimir Putin, but it didn't help Marine Le Pen because she could not beat Emmanuel Macron in the presidential election. So I think that Russia, of course, is important for the Europeans, but I don't think that there's a blatant, direct influence on European politics. There is a direct influence of Russia in Middle Eastern politics. Yes.
Glenn, I want to bring you in for the final thought here. A political scholar from Duke said that Donald Trump is not necessarily isolated in his embrace of nationalism. He said, but his allies are mostly second-tier players like Poland, Hungary, Italy, and not the big guys like Germany and France. Is there a realignment happening as you see it? Or are we on our way to a realignment?
Well, it certainly seems that way. Well, it does depend if this new populist rise continues. But I guess overall, what happened after the Cold War was the East-West divide in terms of communism versus capitalism fell apart. And I guess in the West, we kind of revived the ideological divide by creating a new divided Europe based on liberal democracies versus authoritarian states. Now, what has happened in the last few years has been a crisis in liberalism. And for the likes of Donald Trump, they essentially are reconfiguring or reconceptualizing the main challenge in the world. So it's no longer liberal democracies versus authoritarian states. Rather, they see the world through the lens of nationalists protecting the nation state versus these globalists and cosmopolitans who are seeking to undermine the nation state. So I would argue that it's a period of excessive liberalism, which is now having a kickback from more classical conservatism being pushed in. So I think this is quite significant for countries, not just Poland and Hungary, which identifies Europe very different than the Germans in terms of traditional European values and culture, as opposed to the Germans who look more at a civic identity. But it's also quite important for Russia because for the rest of these populists, if the divide is no longer between liberal democracies and authoritarian states, but rather between nationalists and cosmopolitans, then Russia suddenly goes from being an adversary to an ally because it rises as this international conservative power, one that tries to protect the Christianity, traditional European values, the family unit, and essentially rejects a lot of this postmodernism and globalism which comes out of the West.
Okay. And that will be our final word. Gentlemen, thank you so much for the conversation. We appreciate it very much. Renaud Girard, David DeRochis, and Glenn Dyson. And thank you for watching. You can watch the program again anytime if you go to our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That is facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can join the conversation on Twitter as well. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Rochelle Carey, and the entire team. Bye for now.